Hi, everybody. My name is Ross Fortuny. I'm managing editor here at GovCIO Media and Research, recording from Identity Week America here in DC. Joining me now is Ryan Galluzzo, Digital Identity Program Lead at the National Institutes for Standards and Technology. Thanks for joining me.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So the second draft of NIST Digital Identity Guidelines came out pretty recently. What's in the draft, and how is it different from the one in 22?
Okay. So I think maybe just to make sure there's a quick level setting for those who in your audience who might not necessarily know what the digital identity guidelines are, they're essentially the foundational, functional, technical, and process requirements for identity management systems within the government. So it covers everything from your kind of risk management process. So how do I select how much identity proofing, how much authentication, how much assurance I need in an identity. And then it provides the corresponding technical requirements for how you achieve those levels of assurance. So looking at authentication, what kind of authentication mechanisms I use, whether it's multi-factor, single factor, looking at identity proofing. So how do I actually establish that identity initially? Right. So we look at essentially a kind of not so much a life cycle, but a process of that identity going from identity proofing, which is, basically know your customer. How do I know who they are? How do I understand, at their core, who that identity is? Authentication is being able to give them something that's going to provide for you a degree of confidence that returning user is the same person that you put through the identity proofing process, so you don't have to do it again because nobody enjoys being identity proofed. So the 63 covers all of those things. The digital identity guidelines cover all of those things. We made a pretty substantial number of changes from 863 revision 3, which is the current enforced version of the document, which was updated in 2017. And we released that update, our revision 4 first public draft in November. About 2 weeks ago, we released a second public comment draft. So in that intervening period between releasing the one in December and releasing the one the other day, we had a 119-day public comment period, which is actually pretty long by NIST document standards. Yeah, we wanted to be very deliberate and make sure that we had conversations with a broader set of stakeholders than we might otherwise have. So we did very targeted outreach to federal government agencies, obviously because they're the kind of main consumer, but also having conversations with state and local entities and organizations that support them to try and get more feedback from that community. Working with civil liberties types of organizations to make sure we got feedback from that kind of civil sector, and really just kind of doing as much as we could to get the broadest set of comments and feedback possible. It really worked. We got, I think it was about 130, 140 organizations submitted comments, and we broke all those down. It represented about 3,876 individual items that we needed to address, individual comments we needed to address within the guidance. So that was what the extended period was. That's also why we're doing a second public comment period. It's a little hard to go from a document that gets 3,876 comments to final. So we wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to vet some of the substantial changes. The other reason we're doing a second public comment period is we have introduced a lot of concepts where the standards have only started to really mature in the past year. So things like passkeys, which were very nascent a little over a year and a half ago when we released the document, mobile wallets, mobile driver's license, verifiable credentials, all that stuff. So the main thing that we've done is do a little bit more on a lot of those concepts within this particular revision. So 863A, we've provided additional fraud mitigation requirements. So there are a lot of folks that said, hey, you kind of open the door to some of this fraud mitigation stuff, but what's the minimum bar? What are the recommended things? So we've added some additional fraud mitigation requirements, things like checking for date of death before issuing an identity or credential, and then recommended certain things like, looking at device tenure or account tenure. How long has this account existed? Has it been in state for a long time? Can we have a little bit more confidence that this wasn't just created yesterday as part of a fraud attempt? Looking at transactions history. So is this, or transaction patterns? So is this occurring from a place that we expect it to be occurring from at a location at a time that makes sense for this kind of a transaction to be able to potentially identify fraud. So we've laid out all those things and wrapped them in as well too with a privacy risk assessment to make sure anything you're doing from a fraud mitigation perspective is tied into understanding what the trade-offs might be from a privacy lens. In the base volume, probably the biggest, most substantial change is we've added a list of metrics. So we added this concept of continuous evaluation and improvement in 63 when we released 63 revision 4 when we released it in December of 22. And a lot of people came back and said, we love this idea, but you haven't really said what we should be continuously evaluating and monitoring. And so we've put in place a set of recommended metrics that we think are helpful, at least in allowing organizations to evaluate the efficacy of their system and confirming their ability to meet whatever their organizational objectives are. So those are the big swath items. There's a lot more I can go into.
Sure.
Again, we had 3,800 comments.
As you say, it's not a small document. There's a lot of comments. No. You mentioned the enforced version of the document. What NIST doesn't have enforcement. There's not like NIST regulatory staff to say like you have to do this, you have to do that. What does that sound like? What does that look like? Enforce is what I was trying to say rather than enforce. Okay. So we have an active version that is the one that agencies and organizations should be implementing. We don't make anyone do anything with our guidance. We write our guidance based upon what science and best practices kind of indicate. But there are federal policies that do mandate the application and use of special publications. So until we go final with a version of revision 4, it's not the one that agencies are expected to be implementing. So you said nobody likes identity proofing. I'm sure everybody who has heard a phrase like that very much identifies with it. But fraud is not something that people should not be aware of. So how do you sort of balance that as far as the user experience and making sure that things are secure, locked down, that kind of stuff?
I mean, that's not an easy balance to strike anywhere. But I think what we've tried to do within the context of the guidance is provide pathways and options to meet different expectations and different user sets and to do it at different risk levels. So if you go back to revision 3 where we are now, we have IL1, which is classified as no identity proofing. We have IL2, which is a lot of identity proofing, and we have IL3, which is even more identity proofing. And what we got as feedback was you're missing the like a little bit of identity proofing side of the house. So we've added a new kind of set of requirements in IL1 in revision 4. It essentially says, this is your lowest level of identity proofing. Here's your middle level. Here's your high level. And that corresponds back to the risk that you're going to face. So number one, we've given agencies and organizations that want to use this at least one more pathway or one more level of assurance. That doesn't necessarily mean you immediately have to put people through a high level of friction or a high level of interaction in order to just kind of provide that kind of capacity. At IL2, we've focused on trying to make sure that it was clear that you can have multiple different pathways. So it doesn't just have to be one single approach where you're doing an online process that's completely remote, that uses a biometric, that does this, does this. We've tried to create multiple pathways to give people as many different potential pathways to success as possible when going through an identity proofing process. But at the end of the day, we focus primarily on what are the specific threats and risks that we can deal with, and what are the challenges that we can deal with, and how can we structure the guidance so that it is explicitly targeted to the risks that you're expecting to see at each one of those levels. We've also given agencies the ability to tailor, to be able to sit back and say, look, this is our user audience, this is our population. Some of these approaches and some of these controls might simply not work, right? People might not have a smartphone. People might not have reliable access to high power, high speed internet. Like there's certain considerations that they can make and make risk-based decisions to say, look, I'm not going to implement control A, B, C, or D because it's just not going to work for my audience. It's going to be either too much friction or it's not going to work because of their capabilities or the technology they have access to. That's a reasonable thing for any agency to do. Our only expectation is understand that risk, understand what kind of additional threats might be exposed by not implementing that risk, document it, and kind of monitor it on an ongoing basis.
Well, I was going to say, I think that when it comes to agencies, particularly in the public sector, there's mandate is to serve everybody, and there aren't going to be one size fits all things. A huge document like this obviously is not going to have one size fits all thing, but how do you sort of recommend how the Department of Veterans Affairs deals with something versus the Social Security Administration, and how important is it for them to have similar standards for interoperability versus, the specific needs that they have?
So I think there's the expectation, or we should be clear that the expectation is what we provide in our assurance levels is considered a baseline, right? And so it's something that risk management is ultimately the agency's responsibility. So evaluating your user population. And I guess one of the other things to add to what we've done with the base volume is we've added a new step in the risk management process, which is, for lack of a better term, understand your application and understand your users, right? So the very first thing you need to know is, who am I servicing? What is the application going to do? What are they going to be allowed to do within that application? And then make your risk-based decisions based upon that kind of baseline. So from a interoperability perspective, this is always a challenge if you're looking to kind of do point-to-point interoperability. It changes a little bit if you're starting to have conversations about things like shared services where, hey, if I'm going to be communicating to another entity, this is the level that I operate at. That becomes very important that organization that's relying on that actually understands what you're doing in your implementation. So it can't be just simply, hey, I'm at IL2. It's like, hey, I'm at IL2 and I need to lay out either through a trust framework or a practice statement or an agreement. This is where I may have deviated or changed or implemented something outside the norm of the guidance. And this is why I did it. And then that gives the other organization to say, all right, I'm VA, SSA has done something slightly different than me, but I understand what that risk is and I can accept it. And we can offer that kind of level of interoperability, but it's never going to be a consistent, we've all implemented things exactly the same, simply because audiences change, companies change, risk tolerances change, and the actual individuals that you're serving are going to have different capabilities and capacities.
Yeah, they're going to have different. Kenneth Gant talked about his 83-year-old mother, and it resonates with me. My mother's of a little bit younger, but of a similar age, and there's going to be things that she's not going to be able to do that I am.
Absolutely.
As a millennial versus.
I mean, like a great example is like SMS-based authentication, right? We don't like it. It's very weak. It's got a lot of weaknesses to it. It's got a lot of vulnerabilities to it. It is susceptible to many different kinds of attacks. But if you have a user population that doesn't have a smartphone, that can't use an authenticator app, that can't use, Touch ID with a pass key or something like that, you still want them to have multi-factor authentication as an option. So organizations like, and I'm not saying that they actually do this, but like Social Security Administration or VA might say, we are going to keep SMS authentication despite the drawbacks because we have a large number of users who are on phones that might not be smartphones or might not have the capacity for that. Whereas an agency that's servicing a younger population might say, we can take that out and that's not a problem for us because we now take out a risk factor and we know that our user population is a little bit younger, a little bit more tech fluent, and we don't need to offer SMS OTP as an authentication option.
Yeah, that's interesting because the risk part of that, I think, is always sort of fascinating because you can really open yourself up to things, but you do have to serve those people. You can't just leave them out in the cold. That's not how the public sector works. I want to ask about mobile driver's licenses because I know the NCCOE is launching a pilot program on that. I know you've talked about that before. Where is it and what does that look like?
Yeah, I would just make one quick clarification. It's not really a pilot program. So what we do in the NCCOE is we kind of do, it's more like a proof of concept. Okay. So what we're going to do is we will bring in participants from a bunch of different technology providers and parts of the ecosystem and actually tie them together into a full-blown, as close to the real world implementation as possible. But with a pilot, there's like an implication that we're using real world data. We're not doing that. This is all going to be test stuff. But so the goal with the mobile driver's license project is, we've been involved and engaged in standards development. We've been involved and engaged in, like the technology side and understand what's being done there. And we had kind of observed that there's a lot of focus being placed on, the in-person physical interactions with mobile driver's license, and a little less attention, a little less priority paid on, all right, now that I've got this thing, it can't possibly be that the only thing I can do is get on an airplane at the airport with it, right? Because that's not a sufficiently powerful use case to drive a lot of adoption. So how do we bring this cryptographically verifiable, awesome, cool credential into online use cases where we can help do things like reduce fraud, limit friction in the identity proofing process, and really kind of drive value both for the relying parties as well as for the end user. So we took that concept and we really want to focus on that online use case. And we started to look at where are the places where we think we can have the most impact by illustrating this capability. Immediately, financial services came to mind. How can I open an account, access that account, authorize high value transactions? All those are things that we're looking at. government services. So our second use case is going to be government services, looking at how they can leverage that for things like a federated sign-on through like a government CSP, or potentially a credential service provider, or something like using it to access my federal or state level benefits as kind of like an authenticator and identity proofing tool there. And then looking at the healthcare sector, which we haven't spent quite as much time on just yet. So as far as where we're at, we announced our partners in the financial services build, I think 2 weeks ago. So I think the day before actually we released 863 revision 4. And so we've got a number of financial institutions. I can't remember them all off the top of my head. We've got a wallet provider or 2 wallet providers that can be able to provide, the pathway for presenting the credentials. We have issuers from multiple different states. So I think we have 3 different state level issuers, and they're all going to come together.
Yeah, I would imagine that's where the rubber hits the road, no pun intended, is the interoperability piece of it, because it's just not going to work if it's, again, Kent talked about how he used his mobile driver's license from Virginia in a different state, and they're like, yeah, we can't look this up. This doesn't work for us.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long way to go with some of these things, and I think there's a lot of trust infrastructure that needs to be established. That's still very early, but I mean, I think we're only at 11 states right now, even that can go through TSA, and you need to have the established connections to do all this. But I think, what we're trying to do is bridge some of the gaps in the kind of adoption cycle to understand, all right, how do we get all the technical protocols in place? Because they're all still kind of being finalized right now. But also, how can we start thinking about what's needed to make this viable for actual business solutions and business problems and business challenges, to make that not just I can use this from a technical perspective, but I want to use this, and how do I use it? Where does it fit into business process? So trying to attack both of those things in the work that we're doing, and also at the same time create a bit of a feedback cycle for the work that we're doing when it comes to engaging with the standards bodies. So where might there be gaps? Where might there be issues with the implementations? What do we need to profile? So what do we need to say, in this particular spec, there's 12 optional things. What do those 12 optional things actually need to be used and need to be mandatory? What do the implementation patterns look like? So it's a lot, but we're really excited about the work, and we've got a really good set of partners that we're going to work with on it.
And thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
GovCast, along with HealthCast and Cybercast, is a production of GovCIO Media and Research. To explore our content, visit our website, govciomedia.com. Keep an eye out for new episodes every Tuesday. And if you like what you heard, leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. Have a topic you want us to discuss? Contact us at newsletter@govcio.com.